Welcome to the first video lecture for managing public organizations here at Clayton State. As a general rule, these lectures will focus on broad topics rather than a recap of your textbook. So please complete all the readings as well as the other assignments, and do not rely on those lectures to cover those readings or assignments. In addition to your readings, you will have fireside chats and some externally sourced videos to review each week. Note that all this material is fair game for this exam, so please watch and take notes so that you'll be adequately prepared for the exam questions. For this week, my lecture will focus on leadership generally, as well as a review of the servant leadership model specifically. There are many different leadership styles one may adopt in their career. The servant leadership model has been one of the most common ones I've experienced as a public servant. All the materials provided for your review in this first week implicates that model, although for the most part does not call it out specifically. Beyond this leadership overview, we will have a fireside chat loaded up with two of my colleagues who have achieved significant amount of successes in their fields. As I've noted in the syllabus, these are designed to offer some real-world context to balance out the academic aspects of the course. Next, we'll have 4 externally sourced videos from notable leaders in our society. These videos include the Harvard Kennedy School Dean Doug Elmendorf describing the 5 core principles he believes all of us who are trying to advance the public interest should hold. There'll be an interview between Andrea Mitchell and Admiral William McCraven that discusses the fundamentals and nuances of good leadership, in an interview sponsored by the Aspen Institute. We'll hear from Liz Theophile, a past Chief Technology and Digital Officer for Novartis, who describes the role of servant leader in effective management during a TEDx talk. And then lastly, we'll hear from General Colin Powell, who discusses the leadership lessons he has learned over the course of his career to members of the National Association of Counties. It's important to note that this presentation was part of General Powell's involvement and the National Association of Counties leadership program, and this was offered to its membership. While there's no right answer to what leadership path an individual should take, these presentations offer some insight into fundamental elements that all leaders should strive for, as well as providing some good insight into these notable leaders' personal leadership journey. Finally, I note that you will have to complete reading chapters 1 and 2 this week in the Effective Public Manager. So leadership as a commodity. The value of this skill set can and should be grown over time. This is a professional skill that you should constantly seek and expand in your toolkits, and never let this aspect of your professional lives get dull. It's something that all organizations look for. If you can demonstrate proficient leadership in your resume, it's going to sell you as a potential candidate for a job in those organizations. So view leadership as a commodity, treat it as a commodity, and invest in the development of it as you go throughout your career. There's no one generally accepted definition of leadership. In fact, in a study analyzing materials written between 1900 and 1990, Rost found more than 200 different definitions of leadership. And that definition has continued to grow over the last 30 years. Efforts to define leadership have evolved since the 1900s, when scholars began examining this skill in earnest. For about 30 years, starting in 1900, scholars characterized leadership as control, coupled with the centralization of power, often characterized by domination of the leader over subordinates. This definition began to evolve in the 1930s, shifting from the domination concept to a focus on influencing how leaders' specific personality traits were able to be used to influence the actions of a group. In the 1950s, scholars crafted 3 themes for leadership. One was the group theory, which focused on what leaders did as part of a group process. The second was relational leadership, where leadership is defined based on the behavior of the leader and how that leader develops shared goals with the group he or she is in charge of. And finally, effectiveness, in which leadership is defined by a leader's ability to influence the overall effectiveness of his or her group. Moving into the 60s, we saw a shift in focus onto leadership as a behavior that influences people towards a shared goal. What leadership acts influence people towards that shared direction was really what scholars focused on in the 1960s. So it was very much a behavioral perspective on leadership. The group focus of the 1960s gave way to a more organizational focus in the 70s, whereby leadership became defined as initiating and maintaining groups or organizations to accomplish group or organizational goals. So it was really the organizational theory of leadership that predominated in the 1970s. In the 1980s, we saw an explosion of research into leadership, with scholars coalescing into 4 separate groups. These groups were those who described leadership in a domineering fashion, where followers did as the leader wished; those who described leadership as an influencer towards followers in a non-coercive manner. This concept also used to differentiate between leadership and management. A third area where traits focused orientation towards leadership, where focus is on leadership as excellence, and what traits does one need to develop to achieve that excellence. So it's more of a developmental perspective on leadership. And then finally, the concept of transformational leadership first came up in the 1980s. And this is where leaders and followers actively engage one another in a process that raises one another to a higher level of motivation and performance. Coming into my professional life in the 1990s, transformational leadership was one that was talked about quite a bit early on in my career. Since the 1980s, the focus of scholarly work on leadership has focused on the process of leadership rather than developing new definitions of leadership. In other words, what process is most effective to use when leaders are trying to motivate and influence a group towards a common goal. We will discuss one of these concepts later in this presentation called servant leadership, which is a prevalent form of leadership that I've seen at CDC over the course of my career. While scholars generally agree that there is no one definition of leadership, there are common components that can help us understand the concept of leadership generally. So leadership is a process. Leadership involves influence between the leader and the followers. Leadership occurs in groups, and leadership involves a common set of goals. Based on these components, the working definition I will use for this course is leadership is a process whereby an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. This definition acknowledges some key aspects of leadership research over the years that are undeniable. The first is leadership is a process between the leader and a group. How that process plays out, whether it's domineering, collaborative, or some other way, does not discount the fact that a process does indeed exist between leaders and groups. The concept of influence as a way to describe the interplay between leaders and groups is important. Without this interaction, leadership does not exist. And again, it's not what kind of influence, be it coercive or collaborative or persuasive. It's just that kind of influence does exist between leaders and groups. Third, groups are the context in which leadership occurs, regardless of group size or task. So if there's a team project that needs to be worked on, you're going to have a leader and you're going to have followers, and that's the context in which this happens. It's hard to have some kind of group process without at least one leader driving it for the entire group. And lastly, common goals. This really reflects the mutual purpose that exists between a leader and a group, and really why they've come together to work on whatever the project happens to be. It's the defining of those common goals that bring the leader and the group together and ultimately measure whether they succeed or fail as a unit. In addition to understanding the history of leadership scholarship and how the definition of leadership has changed over time, it's also important to address some nuances in the concept of leadership that can often be confusing. Namely, trait versus process leadership, assigned versus emergent leadership, leadership in power, leadership in coercion, and leadership in management. And I'll take each in turn. The concept of trait leadership is that there are certain attributes that an individual possesses that makes that person a born leader. Height, intelligence, extroversion, and fluency are common traits that are often attributed to individuals who are viewed as born leaders. Alternately, the process view of leadership views leadership as a process that resides in the interactions that can be observed between a leader and his or her followers, a process that can be learned and developed rather than bestowed upon someone at birth. In my view, and I believe the view shared by all the presentations in this section of the course, is that leadership is a learned trait rather than an innate ability that someone is born with. You certainly can have some individual characteristics that help with your leadership moving forward, but leadership really is something that can be learned by many people. And I think when you read or listen to the Colin Powell presentation, you'll hear that he was not a very good student, but he was able to learn leadership skills through his involvement with the ROTC in college. And I think that's an important point that bolsters the difference between between trait versus process leadership. Now, in the area of assigned versus emergent leadership, in this instance, we are distinguishing between a formal leadership role that is part and parcel of a job an individual has in an organization versus an informal leadership role that one possesses by virtue of their group and how they respond to that individual. Emergent leadership really reflects one's ability to influence a group regardless of a formal title or role, and emerges over time through group interaction and communications. I think a quote from one of my colleagues bears this difference out. She once said that, "I don't need a vote at the table so long as I have a voice at the table." Meaning that so long as she has the ability to influence the vote, she's got a significant amount of power and leadership residing within her, even if she doesn't have a formal position. Emergent leaders often have certain personality traits, dominance, intelligence, confidence, that support the emergence of this informal role. The important thing to note here is that regardless of your assigned role, both assigned and emergent leaders will exert leadership and influence over a group. And it's important that both assigned and emergent leaders are in sync in order for success to be achieved. I'll also note that I think typically emergent leaders are early on in their career, and assigned leaders tend to be later on in their career when they've risen to a certain level within the organization. The next area I'd like to cover is leadership and power. Power is tied to the notion of leadership because the role a leader has in influencing a group is tied with the power possessed by that leader. Power or capacity to influence others and people in a leadership position have the ability to affect others' beliefs, attitudes, and course of action for good or bad. I'll now offer up an example of this from my own experience. I was once a member of a unit that was slated to be merged with another unit for efficiency purposes. There were differences in the composition of each unit, particularly from an academic credentialing and level of responsibility perspective, but our work was complementary to each other. The head of the other unit was opposed to the merger and utilized a more authoritarian approach to leadership that included limiting her team's ability to engage others and asserting motivations associated with the merger that were not entirely accurate. And it created a bit of fear in the team that she led. As a result, there was some significant tension and apprehension associated with the merger, as one would expect. The office I operated in took a very servant leadership approach to the team, prioritizing relational aspects of leadership. When the merger was complete, the authoritarian leader was downgraded from her formal leadership role, and her team members were divided amongst two separate teams with newly appointed team leads. While attempts were made by the former leader to maintain some level of informal influence, the relationship approach to leadership facilitated a more open and developmental work environment. And this approach overcame those continued attempts to exhort informal leadership on her part. The tension and the apprehension soon vanished in favor of positive, supportive, and a complementary work environment. So there is that informal role, but it's not an informal leadership role that you can always rely on. You may end up losing that role if you attempt to exert your leadership in an inappropriate manner, and it's important to keep that in mind. The point of this example is that power of leadership can be used for good and bad, and the job of a good leader is to ensure that power is used for positive purposes. whether that power is formal or informal. In the context of power, there are really 6 bases of power which can be described in terms of how a leader performs. The first is referent power, which refers to the follower's identification with and like of a particular leader. So they like this leader, they feel comfortable with this leader has established a very good rapport with his or her team, and they appreciate that. The second is expert power, and this is tied to the follower's perception of the leader's competence in whatever specific area that team is working in. In my case, we have a number of subject matter experts in the field of public health who have an extraordinary wealth of knowledge in those areas and are viewed as subject matter experts in that area, and they have a significant amount of power when it comes to deciding how to pursue certain things because of that. Legitimate power is linked to a formal job authority. So if you're given the assignment as a team leader or manager at any level, you come to that position with a certain amount of legitimate inherent power that you can utilize as you manage and lead your team. Fourth area is reward power, and this is the ability to reward others for performance. And most organizations have some sort of performance award process. At CDC, it's a combination of simple recognitions with certificates, to time off awards, to actually cash awards. So there's a significant amount of reward power that can be exerted when leading a team at CDC. The fifth is a coercive power, which is the alternative to the reward power, in that others can be penalized for poor behavior or poor performance. And this is not often an area that I utilize. In fact, I don't think I've ever utilized the coercive power specifically. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that in the next segment. And then last is information power. And this is derived from possessing power, information power that others want or need. So someone who's a subject matter expert may have knowledge about a particular situation or public health approach that others in the organization may not be aware of or have information on. And having that information, possessing that information, in and of itself presents a power structure for you as a subject matter expert. In addition to these 6 bases of power, there are 2 types of power that can be exerted by a leader. One is positional power, and one is personal power. Positional power is typically power tied to a formal organizational role. And here, leaders will typically have 4 of the 6 power bases that I've just described: legitimate power, reward power, coercive power, and information power. Having a formal role in the organization will give you likely immediate access to all 4 of these types of power. Personal power, on the other hand, is tied to the perception that a leader is likable and knowledgeable, so the power bases tied to this type of power are generally referent power and expert power. Now keep in mind, these power bases and types of power are not linked in a hard and fast manner. For instance, someone with personal power may not have a formal role, but by virtue may have a certain level of information power tied to their status as a subject matter expert. So these aren't hard and fast, but generally speaking, those are how these 6 personal powers divide out. These 6 powers divide out between the personal power one possesses, as well as the inherent power that comes with a formal position. Next, we'll talk about leadership and coercion. I've highlighted coercion as a power because it represents a relatively unique power in that it is inconsistent with the preferred leadership approach of influencing others towards a common goal. The use of coercion is typically associated with the dark side of leadership behaviors, like Hitler and Stalin or the Taliban, each of whom used power and restraint to force followers to engage in extreme behaviors. Typically, this power is used not to influence a group towards a common goal, but rather towards a personal goal of the leader that benefits the leader and not necessarily the group as a whole. It is a power that may exist in my toolbox as a leader, but I've never used it because, in my view, it's counterproductive and inconsistent not only with our corporate culture, but also my personal leadership style. Sadly, it is a power I have seen utilized at CDC on occasion, And although the results in the short term may be positive, in the long term it's often poor. And it makes for a high level of turnover and really not much allegiance toward the leader that's exerting that type of power. Finally, I want to address the differences between leadership and management. Distinguishing between these two concepts, especially early in one's career, can be challenging for some, and it was for me. There's a great deal of overlap between the concepts in that both entail working with people, both are focused on goal management and achievement, and arguably our working definition of leadership could be applied to management as well. However, there are some key differences between the two. First, the study of leadership can arguably extend all the way back to Aristotle, whereas the study of management is typically tied to the industrialization of our economy around the early 20th century. The primary function described by Fayol in the early 20th century, planning, organizing, staffing, and controlling, are still applicable today in terms of management. In fact, some argue that the inherent nature of leadership to produce change and movement are completely dissimilar to management, which is dedicated to providing organizations with order and consistency. In truth, leaders are often charged with managing and leading people at the same time, and the two skill sets are often complementary. For instance, leaders establish direction, and managers build budgets to fulfill that direction. Leaders assign people to achieve goals, and managers organize those people through a structured staffing plan to work towards those goals. Leaders seek to motivate and inspire people, while managers work to control and problem solve using incentives and creative solutions. They can be complementary. And during the fireside chat, one of my speakers, Lisa Bratton, adeptly describes how leadership and management are different, but also complementary skill sets that are required in a modern organization. That's towards the end of the presentation, and I encourage you to pay special attention to that. This concludes our overview of leadership. Now we'll delve a little bit deeper into one leadership style, servant leadership. As I indicated previously, I'm focusing on this style because I have found it to be a consistent thread not only in the materials provided you today for the first week of this course, but also because I've seen it to be the prevalent approach for leadership within CDC as well as the Department of Health and Human Services over the course of my career. The concept of servant leadership is on its face a bit of a contradiction. How can one both serve and lead? This question was taken up by Greenleaf in the 1970s, and the concept of servant leader was born from this contemplation. Servant leadership and the study of it really focuses on the behavior of the individual. In this instance, the behaviors that characterize a servant leader approach to leadership include empathy towards others, attentive to the concerns of their followers, nurturing their followers, putting the well-being of their followers first, empowering their followers in the roles that they have within the organization, developing their followers to advance in their careers, and finally, and maybe most importantly, ethically leading your followers in a manner that serves the greater good of the community, the organization, and society as a whole. There are many complex definitions of servant leadership, but the simplest approach is often the best for me. So in that vein, I believe a mashup of these definitions would fit the bill. So in my view, the servant leader places the good of followers above his own self-interest and emphasizes follower development. They accomplish this in part through ethical leadership towards their followers, partners, and stakeholders. That's how I view servant leadership in practice in the job that I do, and it is what I've observed at CDC as other servant leaders have led their units in the same manner. There are 10 characteristics that comprise what it means to be a good servant leader, and I'm going to go through each one of these characteristics for you in turn. The first characteristic is listening. And this is an important characteristic to have as a servant leader. Communications between leader and followers must be an interactive process, with servant leaders striving to listen first and talk second. Listening first is a learned skill and not always an easy one to default to. So it takes some discipline, but generates an enormous amount of benefit within the team or organization. The second characteristic is empathy. Empathy is having the ability to stand in a follower's shoes and attempt to see the world from their perspective. Being able to do this genuinely when confronted with both personal and professional situations builds a strong level of allegiance to the leader and confidence in the follower. Part of the ability to do that is having the work experience to empathize with whatever work challenges they're dealing with, and the life experiences to empathize with whatever life experiences that they're dealing with. So it's definitely a characteristic that can be developed over time, and it's one that's been very valuable to me in my experience as a leader. The third characteristic is healing. And here servant leaders strive to care about the personal well-being of their followers, helping them overcome personal issues in an appropriate way, and it can also be a two-way street with them supporting the servant leader during his or her time of need. It builds strong personal connections between and among leaders and followers, and is a key element in building a high-performing team. Now, obviously, you need to be careful about this and use your best judgment when engaging in this healing process. There are things that you can do that are appropriate, and there may be things you shouldn't do when trying to help an employee through the healing process, particularly when it comes to personal issues. There are services at most organizations that help employees handle difficult situations, mental health situations, that type of thing. And I've often referred some employees to that when the situation was appropriate. But it is important to be available and do the best that you can to help them through that healing process. The fourth characteristic is awareness. This means that a servant leader is both self-aware of the impact their actions have on their followers, and is also aware of the physical, social, and political environments that may impact the performance of their followers. I've often told my team that my job is to assign their tasks and then remove any barriers they may face in the accomplishment of that particular task. Having this kind of awareness affords a servant leader the ability to both identify those obstacles and remove them effectively. Self-awareness is also an important thing that you should strive to attain through the course of your career as an employee and as a leader. At CDC, we use a 365 evaluation that provides us with, that provides us with the opportunity to get anonymous feedback from subordinates, peers, and supervisors on our performance in a number of different areas. And this is very helpful to identify areas that you need to work on, and very helpful to identify the strengths that you have as a manager and as a leader. It's not always easy to see some of this information, but it is important if you're committed to growing as a leader throughout your career. The fifth is persuasion. And persuasion as a characteristic in this context is viewed as clear and consistent communication that convinces others to change. This is not an exercise in coercion, where the follower is forced to comply. Rather, it is a use of gentle, non-judgmental encouragement or persuasion to make a change. So a good example of this is one of my team members expressed a desire to overcome her fear of public speaking, a skill set that she would need to advance her career. We placed this developmental goal on her development plan for the year, and as opportunities would present themselves, I would raise this goal with her, remind her of it, encourage her to pursue it, and I also looked for opportunities for her to do just that. Now, admittedly, she got a bit annoyed with me at times because I continued to raise this issue, but I knew it was her goal, and I knew it was an important goal for the future of her career. And in the end, she did take a number of courses to develop this skill set and was appreciative of my non-judgmental, gentle nudging of her to pursue it. And in the end, her speaking skills, public speaking skills, improved significantly. The sixth area is the concept of conceptualization. And this refers to a servant leader's role or ability to be a visionary for the organization by providing a clear sense of goals and direction. I've seen this play out in a couple ways during my career. For example, since assuming a leadership position at CDC, regardless of where I am within the organization, my unit has always developed a unit strategic plan that links directly to our overall organizational plan and provides both team members and customers a clearly defined set of expectations for our role in the bigger picture. Our plan is revisited each year by the entire unit, evaluated periodically over the course of the year, and the final results are presented to our leadership. In addition, I work strongly and hard to make sure that our division as a whole has a strategic plan. And this is important to me because I manage the public affairs for my particular division. And part of that is communicating to the powers that be, either Congress or the administration or our strategic partners, what our goals and objectives are and how our budget ties to those goals and objectives. And a lack of a strategic plan made it a bit difficult to do that part of my job. Now, we did have a plan, but the plan was at least 5 years old, and no one in the division really knew much about it. So we were able to develop that plan and build from it and plan from it and provide our partners in Congress and the administration a clearer perspective on what it is that we were working on. The next characteristic is foresight. And in this context, foresight does not mean that a servant leader suddenly becomes Nostradamus and can predict the future for everything. What it does mean is that it's an expectation that a servant leader can assess past and current events and not only make reasonable predictions for the future, but also plan and act accordingly. So really exercise an advanced level of analytical skills so that they can project what's likely to happen moving forward. So for instance, at CDC, we traditionally see budgets that increase when Democrats are in control of Congress. The midterm elections are coming up, and historically these elections result in a transfer of power, which in this case would be from a democratically controlled Congress to a Republican-controlled Congress. We've looked at the past. We've seen this happen before. We know what the impacts of this transition in power could be for our programs. And so we're currently discussing the most appropriate way that we can plan for this transition, how we can communicate better about our programs to a Republican-controlled Congress, and what we might expect in terms of a budget over the 2 years that they would be in charge. The eighth category is characteristic is stewardship. And here, stewardship represents a bit of an overlap between leadership and management. By agreeing to lead and manage a team, a servant leader commits to carefully managing that group of people in an ethically and responsible manner for the greater good of society. It's an important thing to take on. And during the fireside chat, we discussed this a bit, and both Galen and Lisa both agree that you need to have an understanding of what you're taking on when you assume a leadership position and the responsibility that you have towards your followers. And if it's not something you're comfortable doing, then you just shouldn't do it. And I can't agree with them more on that point. It's a lot of responsibility, and you need to really consider it carefully before you take it on. It's very rewarding. It does help advance your career, but quite honestly, it's not for everyone. So be clear about that. The ninth characteristic is commitment to growing people. And in the servant leader model, a person places a premium on treating each follower as a unique person with intrinsic value that goes beyond the tangible contributions they bring to the organization. In this role, a servant leader helps each follower grow personally and professionally. A good example of this occurred a few years ago. We were able to hire a contractor on our team into a permanent CDC position. This is a bit unusual, and this individual was coming into CDC as a full-time employee at mid-career. So in an effort to maximize her opportunities to advance her career, we crafted a job plan that provided her experiences in both management and the policy aspects of our team. This afforded her the ability to gain valuable experience in both career ladders, as well as the opportunity to improve her promotion potential in the future. And that has paid dividends for her. While she's not with my team anymore, she has been able to use those experiences to gain a new position initially, and then later a promotion. And she and I actually had a conversation about the benefits that this afforded her after she took the new promotion. So I'm happy that that worked for her, and I think it's a good example of what a commitment to growing people looks like. And the final trait is building a community. As a servant leader, we strive to build a community within the organization that unites individuals in a shared vision and provides them with a safe and connected space where they can thrive and achieve as individuals and team members. This is something that does not happen overnight, but rather is accomplished by doing the little things, celebrating achievements, recognizing birthdays, supporting each other in times of loss or need, recognizing good work, socializing and celebrating as a group. These may strike you as soft skills, and I think that they are, in fairness, or even annoying, which for some it is. But the benefits of creating this community are exponential when compared to the cost of doing it. And some of the things that we do is we have a social committee, and we do periodic social events. We've done less in COVID, but we've certainly done a few, mostly in outdoor settings. We recognize employees of the quarter and employees of the month. When we're in the office, we have their pictures posted on a bulletin board with the appropriate recognition associated with that. So there's a number of different things that you can do that really facilitates the building of this community. As with many leadership theories, academics have built on the initial Greenleaf concept, placing their own spin on it. I'm not really inclined to review those individual reinterpretations of servant leadership here today. I think the broad brushstrokes are sufficient for us at this point. However, there are some things you should be aware of when it comes to the practical application of this leadership style. First, when adopting this approach to leadership, the leader has committed to doing a number of things, some of which can be difficult. These include placing their followers before their own motivations or needs, being honest with your followers to a fault, fairly treating your followers, prioritizing listening to your followers first, and developing long-term relationships with your followers. And I will tell you this, this last one in particular resonates with me. I've had a number of leadership positions over the last 15 to 20 years, and I can say without reservation that I continue to talk with and meet and discuss developmental things with a number of folks who served on my team in the past. And many of them are in leadership positions now. But we continue to stay in touch and have those discussions and communications. And I've really built not only a work friendship, but a real out-of-work friendship as well. And I think that's important if you're committing to a servant leadership model. By committing to these actions, a servant leader develops a clear understanding of the abilities, needs, and goals of their followers, which in turn allows followers to achieve their own potential. While the servant leader approach can be learned, it is helpful for a leader to have an inherent altruistic nature and a strong motivation to help and serve others. This may be why it's a prevalent approach at CDC right now. It's also helpful to have followers that are open to the concept of servant leadership, because its success or failure relies on an interaction between the leader and the followers, and the followers are not inclined to participate in that process, then it's likely servant leadership isn't going to work. Now, there are some strengths and criticisms associated with this approach, and I'd like to go over those now. In terms of strengths, servant leadership is the only construct that makes altruism the central component of the leadership process. In other words, the central organizing principle is caring for people, and this is the only leadership process that really does that. Servant leadership is also a bit counterintuitive in the way it describes the use of power and influence between a leader and a follower. In opposition to every other approach, servant leadership seeks to distribute power to the followers and give up a certain amount of control, and this is unique in this particular construct. This utilizes influence in a unique way, and it runs counter to most leadership theories and the predominant corporate cultures in our society. But that doesn't mean it doesn't work. Additionally, researchers into servant leadership have identified some inherent limitations to the construct's utility. As I've said before, specifically, if followers are willing to engage in this type of leadership arrangement, or unwilling to engage in this type of leadership arrangement, then the utility of it is limited. That said, if you do pursue a servant leadership style, and that is your preferred style of management, chances are most people are going to resonate with that. And the ones who do not like that type of leadership style are going to move on to a different position. And that's not a bad thing. Different strokes for different folks, and you're not always going to have one-to-one sync with everybody on your team. So realize that, recognize that, and don't worry too much about that. Most organizations are large and have plenty of places for people to relocate, and that gives you new opportunity to bring folks in that are committed to a servant leadership style and want to engage you as a leader and their peers in that approach, and that helps out with everyone. There are also a number of criticisms to servant leadership that should be acknowledged. First is the oxymoronic notion of a servant leader, as discussed previously. It's hard to be a servant and a leader because they're kind of different concepts. This may diminish the value of the approach by people dismissing this out of hand simply because the oxymoronic nature of the two terms confuses them, and they just don't want to get involved in that kind of thing. The effectiveness of servant leadership also has limited documentation, and there remain some disagreements about researchers attempting to establish a commonly accepted definition of servant leadership. So while we've been seeing servant leadership implemented over 30 years, there aren't a lot of scientific data around the effectiveness of the approach per se. The altruistic nature of servant leadership, prioritizing others over self, often runs contrary to the other more prevalent leadership styles, and this may result in leaders dismissing this approach without testing it first. They may not understand what that looks like and what benefits them. And, honestly, it probably runs a bit counter to our natural, innate inclination to do what's best for ourselves, make profits, et cetera, et cetera. So that altruistic nature may be a turnoff for some in organizations. Finally, including the conceptualization as a core component of servant leadership is confusing to some. Arguably, conceptualization is a core component for all leadership types, and so it's unclear why this would be included as a core component for the servant leadership model, but that's more of an academic issue than anything else. While there certainly are some challenges with implementing this approach to leadership, the benefit servant leadership has over many other approaches is 30 years of successful implementation in both private, nonprofit, and government organizations. And while there's not a lot of scientific data that supports that, anecdotally you can see a number of organizations have successfully utilized servant leadership in the management and operations of their corporations and organizations. Implementation of this approach would certainly require training, as well as a receptive workforce, but the content and the concepts are very straightforward and easily understood. So that should not be a barrier to utilizing servant leadership in a broad way for any particular organization. I hope this PowerPoint has provided you a good overview of leadership as a general concept and servant leadership as one option that you may be able to pursue over the course of your career. I will say that there is a resource out there that I think is great if you're interested in learning about other leadership styles. We just don't have enough time to go through each and every one of them, mainly because there's dozens of them, and I could do a whole course just on leadership. But there's a book. It's titled Leadership, Theory and Practice by Northouse, and it's available on Amazon. It's in its 8th edition, and it provides a very good overview of many, many leadership styles that are being used out in the real world today. So if you are interested in reading up on some of those, that would be a great resource for you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about leadership. I'm happy to take questions either over email or during my scheduled office hours. And again, we do have that Wednesday evening meeting scheduled as well, so you can certainly come online with me through Microsoft Teams and ask me questions about this presentation or any of the others. I'd be happy to talk more in depth with you about that. Thank you so much, and have a great week going through the materials.